Welcome once again, my fellow manipulators of Digital Fate. I'm Richie, this is Capricorn, and today is day 10 of spoiler season. Man, this spoiler season is just dragging on forever. It seems like they're just drip feeding us cards every single day to make it last as long as possible, but I'm pretty sure this is the beginning of the end, the penultimate episode, if you will, the second to last video I'm going to make for spoilers. We should get all of the rest of them tomorrow for a grand finale. We'll get the common dump, we'll get the leftovers, rares, and all of that sort of thing. So, looking forward to that, but we do have a number of very interesting spoilers to go over today, so we're going to dump them all on you and just get right into it. Before we do, please like the video. It helps me get the video out to so many more people, which helps the channel to grow, and I would appreciate it so much. Subscribe if you're new so you never miss an upload. Tons of crazy content on the way, and catch me live Monday through Friday over on Twitch. That's twitch.tv/quarantinecapricorn, because if I'm alive and I'm breathing, I'm there and I'm streaming. Let's do this thing. First up, we've got Howlsquad Heavy, a 3/4 seal pirate for 1 blue and 3. You can cycle it for 1 blue and 1, and when you cycle this card, target creature or vehicle an opponent controls gets -3/-0. It's a 3/4 for 4. This isn't anything super good, but it is a common, and it's a pretty decent card to pick up a little bit later in the draft, considering the fact that it does cycle, and there are a number of payoffs for discarding cards within this set. So if you're in that archetype within Limited, right, where you're getting payoffs for discarding things, you get some versatility with this card, replace itself with something better, dig deeper for your bomb, trigger your discard payoffs, and get some extra value by giving something -3/-0. And it's pretty nice having that versatility tacked onto a body so that if you're desperate and you just need board presence, you can just slam the guy on 4 and hold the line, hold off aggro. Not bad for a common. Nothing crazy. You're not going to like pick it super high or anything, but I still think it's pretty good, especially, well, I guess maybe you might pick it relatively high if you are in the discard deck. If you have payoffs for discards, cycling this, redrawing a card, triggering all your payoffs, and getting -3/-0 as a combat trick seems like a lot of value. So the more I think about it, I think if that archetype is deep enough within Limited, this might be a much higher pick. Still not crazy, not like a pack one, pick one or anything, but depending on what you're playing, there's definitely potential. Next up, we've got Broodheart Engine, an artifact for 2 mana in the colors of Golgari. At the beginning of your upkeep, you surveil 1, and you can pay 4 mana in the colors of Golgari, tap it, and sacrifice this artifact. Return target creature or vehicle card from your graveyard to the battlefield. Activate only as a sorcery. This card's kinda nuts. It's like Squirming Emergence, except it costs 1 more than Squirming Emergence, but it doesn't have the hoops to jump through like Squirming Emergence does. I have a feeling Roaming Boss is gonna love this card, but you can just jam it on 2 and also help to surveil, fill up your graveyard, dig into the cards that you need. So it's good in self-mill decks. It's gonna be good in Insidious Roots decks, which a bunch of cards coming out of this set seem like they're good in those kinds of decks. So that's pretty interesting. It's also worth noting that it might be decent in Delirium decks, and I know that most people running Delirium are running Gruul, but me, myself, I personally prefer Jund. There are some really interesting black cards that help, most notably the Overlord of the Balemerc is super good in the Jund Delirium deck, and this might have a home there too. I just like the fact that for 4 mana you can get back whatever, and it doesn't have the same problems as, I forget the name of the card, but there's a 1-drop creature right now that you can sack for 4 mana to get back any creature. It doesn't have the same problems as that because it doesn't die to creature removal, so it's not like they can stop your plan by using, you know, their creature removal they're going to have in their deck anyway to just take it out before you get a chance to use it. They have to go the extra mile and actually have artifact removal, which is going to be a lot less likely to get rid of this before you can trigger it, which is really nice. And the fact that it can hit a vehicle. So, I mean, yes, Valgavoth's Faithful, that's the card. Thank you, Chunky. Shout out to Twitch chat for helping me out there. Valgavoth's Faithful is the 1-drop. But, yeah, I still think this card has a lot of potential, and the fact that it counts as an artifact when it's in your graveyard does matter for things like Delirium decks, so I think it's a really cool card. It's definitely worth experimenting with in a number of decks. But next up, we've got Lightwheel Enhancements, an enchantment aura for 1 white mana, enchants a creature or a vehicle, and has start your engines. So if you're not yet, it will put you at speed 1, so that every single turn that you make your opponent lose life. You can increase that speed by 1, eventually getting to max speed if you get to 4. And when you do get to max speed, you're allowed to cast this thing from your graveyard, just full stop. Like as many times as you want. If it just keeps dying and going back to your graveyard, or they kill the thing that it's on and it goes back to your graveyard, you just keep replaying it from the graveyard as long as you hit max speed. And there's only one card in the whole game, at least that we've seen so far in this set, that can actually take away speed. So I think once you get there, you're pretty safe to just replay this over and over and over. In fact, you could sacrifice this to get value and replay it and sacrifice it and replay it and sacrifice it and replay it. It's not limited to once a turn or anything like that. This could be actually kind of nuts in certain sacrifice decks. And we haven't even got to what the point of the card and what it actually does when it enchants something. Enchanted permanent gets +1/+1 and has vigilance, which is, you know, pretty good. It's negligible, but it's going to matter in those decks that are trying to go wide with enchantments and buff their creatures depending on how many enchantments you have. It'll help with that while giving additional buffs and vigilance to whatever you put it on. But I really think that that max speed loop you can get to is the most interesting part of the card. And I think that's what makes this a little bit better than most commons, honestly. I want to try to brew that. I don't know exactly what kind of payoffs we can get by sacrificing an enchantment over and over and over and over. I don't know if we have any free sacrifice outlets that can get value off sacking this repeatedly. But I'm going to have to do some digging and think about that. If you have ideas about cards like that we could pair this with, definitely let me know in the comments. There's potential for this one for sure. But next up, we've got Howlsquad Heavy. This is a 2/3 Goblin Mercenary for 1 red and 2. It's also our first rare of the day. It also has Start Your Engines, so if you're not at speed 1 yet, it'll put you there. Other goblins you control have haste no matter what. At the beginning of combat on your turn, you create a 1/1 red goblin creature token. That token attacks this combat if able, and since all other goblins you control have haste, it's actually able to attack, even though it doesn't have haste, you know, carved into the token itself. The heavy will give it haste. What's interesting is if they do kill the heavy in response to you making the token, you don't have to swing with it because you can't swing with it, and then you do get to hold it back as a blocker, which probably won't ever come up and ever matter, but it's nice that there's that little bit of extra versatility, I guess. But the real kicker to this card is when you get to max speed, you can tap it to add a red mana for each goblin you control, which is just absolutely disgusting. That ability on its own would be good enough on a card with nothing else on it, but the fact that this is a tribal lord, gives all your goblins haste, makes them all better right out of the gates, and cranks out a red goblin token every single turn for free. I think this might be better than the newer 𝐒𝐏𝐻𝐈 that we got. Forget the full name of that card, but 𝐒𝐏𝐻𝐈, the 3-mana 𝐒𝐏𝐻 that attacks and makes a token that's also attacking every time it does. You can replay it from the graveyard. That was probably the premier 3-drop goblin for potential consideration in goblin decks. I think this might be better. I mean, it's not as aggressive itself the turn that you play it like 𝐒𝐏𝐻 is, but no matter what, you do get that 1/1 token immediately the same turn that you play this, and that 1/1 does attack. So even though this creature itself can't attack like 𝐒𝐏𝐻 can, the token can, right? Which is kind of interesting. I don't know. We're going to have to see how deep Goblin Tribal goes, but I think there's potential for goblins to be insane in Standard. And man, I'm hoping for it, because the mono red we've had to deal with for the last however many months is just getting really, really old. I would love to see mono red shift to being a goblin deck and being a completely different kind of mono red. It would just be a breath of fresh air, especially because like that's all you seem to run into on the ladder these days. So yeah, I think I'm excited about goblins. I'm going to be brewing with this for sure, especially considering the fact that Krenko is back from Foundations. I didn't even think about that. You play this on 3, you play Krenko on 4, it has haste, immediately taps to make a million tokens that also have haste. Game over. Okay, goblins are real. Moving on. Next up, we've got Point the Way. This is an enchantment for 1 green mana. It has Start Your Engines. And it's important to note that 1 mana spells or 1 mana permanents that have Start Your Engines are incredibly important for that archetype, for those mechanics, because you definitely want to make sure you start your engines on turn 1. if you don't play a Start Your Engines card on turn 1, you're going to be behind. You're not going to actually be able to increase your speed until you finally play your first Start Your Engines card. So it's not as simple as just do damage every turn the first 3 or 4 turns. You have to play a Start Your Engines card first. So 1-drops, super, super important, and this does that for green. But then it also has an ability, pay 1 green, and 3, sacrifice this enchantment, search your library for up to X basic land cards, where X is your speed, put those cards onto the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle. This card's nuts. This card is so good. It might be a little too slow, possibly, which is hilarious, because it has the max speed mechanic built into the card. But the value is insane. If you can get to max speed quick enough and sack this, fetching 4 basic lands for 4 mana, and sometimes even less than that if you have things that reduce the cost of your activated abilities or give you mana you can only use for activated abilities, like the Enigma Jewel, stuff like that, this could get really, really gross really, really quick. So really interested to see just where this card could go in Standard. It'll be interesting to see how usable it is in Limited too. I think this card probably signposts some sort of crazy 5-color deck if I was a betting man. It'll be interesting to see if they actually do that. But next up, we've got Grim Bauble. 1 black mana for an artifact. When this artifact enters, target creature an opponent controls gets -2/-2 until end of turn, and then you can pay 1 black and 2, tap and sacrifice the Grim Bauble to Surveil 2. Is this going to be the new 1 mana piece of removal for Pixie decks? I mean, I feel like maybe, right? I feel like this has the potential. This is almost a cut down. It's not quite a cut down, but it's almost a cut down. What's important about this, though, unlike enchantments we've seen in the past that give -2/-2 to the thing they enchant, because those are permanents, right? And those kill a thing. This gives it to a different creature and doesn't have to be put on that creature. So when that creature dies, you still get to keep the Grim Bauble around, and that is huge. Absolutely huge. You can bounce this with your Nurturing Pixie, replay it, kill something else. You can sacrifice it to like Rottenmouth Viper and other things you want to sacrifice it to. I think this card is nuts. I think decks like that want to go wide with things, whether it's to bring back to your hand and replay them or to sacrifice them for value, they're kind of missing that 1-drop piece of removal that fits into the synergies, and they kind of have to pick and choose. Do I play Cut Down, or do I hyper focus on my synergies and play, you know, more expensive removal like Tithing Blade? And this kind of lets you kill 2 birds with 1 stone. I mean, you might still want to play Tithing Blade and some of those other pieces with this, but it's a really, really good option for only 1 mana. And having that extra value packed into it where you can Surveil 2 if you want, means like maybe this gets used in like Self-Mill decks and Delirium decks and stuff like that too. I don't know if it's quite there for that, but it'll be interesting to see because it has potential for sure. I think this card's a slam dunk. I love it. Honestly, as a common, it could have been an uncommon, and I would have believed it. It's not going to be as good in Limited, right? It is Limited, pardon the pun. But I mean, at least it's at least a shock that can hit indestructible creatures, right? That just can't hit the face, and that's not a bad thing. I guess the Surveil 2 really makes this stupid good in Limited, right? It's a shock that can get you value and can kill indestructible things. Yeah, the more I think, and it's an artifact, and there's tons of artifact synergies in this set for Limited, so yeah, the more I think about it, this card's nuts in Limited too. Pick it high. But next up, we've got Kickoff Celebrations, an enchantment for 1 red and 1. It has Start Your Engines, and when this enchantment enters, you may discard a card. If you do, you draw 2 cards. So this is your normal discard a card, draw 2 for the set. There's a variation of this card in pretty much every set ever for the entire history of all time. But this one is super interesting because if you get to max speed, you get to sacrifice this enchantment, and creatures and vehicles you control gain haste until end of turn. Now, there's already a card that does the exact same thing, where we get to discard a card, draw 2, and then get an enchantment that we can sacrifice to give haste. The difference is, that one costs 1 mana to do it. This one costs no mana to do it, but you do have to hit max speed. But if you're in a deck where you are consistently hitting max speed, where you're built around being able to hit max speed. That's not necessarily difficult, and honestly, not having to pay any mana at all could make the difference. If you hit like turn 4 mana, play your 4 mana reanimation spell, and you're able to just sacrifice this as well, even though you have no mana left over, and just like get in that turn and maybe win the game a whole turn sooner, that's probably relevant. So I think it's really interesting. And another thing to keep in mind is just the fact that this can start your engines. Sometimes that matters just by itself. If you're like, oh crap, I don't have a card to start my engines, well, now you have Kickoff Celebrations. It's not the thing you want to be starting your engines with ideally, because you want to start on turn 1, but as a backup thing, like also getting to start your engines when you're a little bit behind and don't have another way to do it, and still getting to discard a card and draw your cards like you would regardless, seems pretty good. So the more I think about this card, the more I like it. I don't know if it's quite there for standard, but I'm excited to find out because it definitely has potential. Next up, we've got Alacrian Armory. This is an artifact for 1 white and 3. Creatures you control get +0/+1 and have vigilance. And at the beginning of combat on your turn, you choose up to 1 target mount or vehicle you control. Till end of turn, that permanent becomes saddled if it's a mount, becomes an artifact creature if it's a vehicle. Pretty interesting. The fact that it buffs your whole team, gives vigilance to your whole team, and saddles or crews something for free every single turn is kind of nuts. The one thing that's a little bit of a bummer about it is the fact that it only triggers for your combats. So it doesn't help you like crew a vehicle to use as a blocker or anything like that. But to play devil's advocate, it gives vigilance. So if you're attacking with anything else whatsoever, that thing is going to remain untapped and easily be able to crew the vehicle you would want to block with anyway. So it doesn't really matter all that much. You're still getting your value there. So the more I think about this, the more I actually really like it. The extra toughness means things can swing in a little more easily with less risk, which makes the vigilance matter more. And then because you get to crew for free, the vigilance matters more as well, because like that mount or vehicle that you're swinging in with doesn't have to tap, so you can still use it as a blocker. There's just a lot of nuance to how you can use this card that makes it way better than I think it appears on the surface. That being said, I don't think it's like bananas, right? It doesn't really give you any board presence the turn that you play it. It just amplifies the board presence that you have, so it has to be played in just the right deck. But even if you don't have a ton of vehicles or mounts, like just playing this as a thing that gives your whole team vigilance and extra defense, and maybe every now and then, like the 1 or 2 vehicles or mounts that you have in your deck, if you happen to get them, it does more. Even that's just pretty good. So I think if you are in the mount or vehicle deck, this might be a relatively high pick, not necessarily like a pack 1 pick 1 or anything, but you probably want to end up with at least one of these by the end of the draft. Outside of that, you can make it work, but it's probably not going to be a priority. Next up, we've got Waxen Shapethief. Alright, this card is kind of bananas. A 0/0 creature shapeshifter for 1 blue and 3. It has flash. You may have this creature enter as a copy of an artifact or creature you control, and it cycles for 2. So not only can this become a creature at instant speed, a copy of whatever creature you want to, you know, be a trap, be a combat trick, blow out your opponent. You can play it in response to removal. Your opponent tries to remove your threat. You flash this in, become a copy of it. It dies, but you still have another copy of it left that they didn't anticipate, ready to go. That seems kind of interesting. Also, you could even do that with a legendary creature, right? If they target your legendary creature, this comes in, becomes a copy of it. The legendary creature they targeted dies to the legendary rule. You let that one go, and you keep this one, and their spell fizzles. That could be interesting. The biggest drawback to clone cards like this in the past is the fact that if you don't have anything to copy, it's kind of a dead card in your hand, right? If you have 0 board presence, it just sits there and you can't do anything, and that's really, really bad. So having cycling, having a way to dig yourself out of that situation is actually a lot more beneficial than it seems on the surface. And having flash, I think, makes this card way, way, way better than people realize. I think people are going to hyper focus on the fact that this is an overcosted clone, that it's a whole 4 mana, and that's too expensive, and yada, yada, yada. And to a certain extent, they're right. If you use it in a normal way, like a normal clone, it is a little bit overcosted. But if you can really take advantage of that flash, and also we haven't even talked about the fact that it can copy artifacts, right? Imagine slamming this in and becoming a copy of Simulacrum Synthesizer, right? It'll trigger the first Simulacrum Synthesizer, give you a big token, and then you'll have 2 on the battlefield that can both be triggered every time you play something that costs 3 or more after that. That seems kind of bananas, and I'm sure there's plenty of other ridiculous artifacts you could copy with this, so it's way better than just a flash clone, right? It can do a lot more, and I would be very surprised if people didn't at least try to play this in that deck, in that artifact deck with Simulacrum Synthesizer, because I think it's such a perfect fit. But any way you slice it, it's a really interesting card with some nuance to how it can be used, and I like it. I'm excited to brew with it. If you have ideas about other artifacts that this could be paired with, that would be absolutely insane. Definitely let me know in the comments, because I feel like there's definitely potential out there. But we're going to move on. Next up, we've got Push the Limit. Push the Limit. This is a sorcery for 2 red and 5. Return all mount and vehicle cards from your graveyard to the battlefield. Sacrifice them at the beginning of the next end step. Vehicles you control become artifact creatures until end of turn. Creatures you control gain haste until end of turn. So this is just a giant, like, Alpha Strike win out of nowhere if your graveyard is full of creatures or vehicles, mounts and vehicles, and if you have enough mana to play this. I feel like this is meant to have a very specific deck built around it. It reminds me a little bit of Over the Top in a way, but I don't know what that deck is or what it looks like yet. 7 mana feels like a lot, and having to jump through the hoops of filling up your graveyard while also figuring out how to come up with 7 mana, those are 2 very different things to have to do in the same deck consistently and efficiently. So I don't know what that deck is. There's probably something, right? That being said, it is an uncommon, so maybe that's not the intention with this card, to be a crazy build around thing for standard. Maybe it's more meant to be like, you know, you play it in limited, and if you get to 7, you just win. You know, you trade your creatures, you trade your mounts and your vehicles as you play the game, and then eventually you get to 7, you play this, everything comes back, and you just win. That might be more realistic, but I think if there are ways to make more mana, generate more mana in your mount and vehicle decks to get to this a little bit earlier, then that increases the chances of this being really relevant. But I don't know, man. It looks too expensive on the surface, but I have this gut feeling that this might be super relevant. I don't know. It's going to be hard to get there, but if you do, you should be just winning the game, right? We're going to have to wait and see, but I would be very surprised if there isn't some sort of mountain vehicle archetype that's meant to use this very, very well. Next up, we've got Deathless Pilot. This is a 2/2 zombie pilot for 1 black and 1. This creature saddles, mounts, and crews vehicles as though its power were 2 greater, which is very, very nice in this set. Can also pay 1 black and 3, return this card from your graveyard to your hand. So this just mounts things over and over and over and over and over, right? And then just keeps coming back if they kill it, so that you can keep powering up your best mounts, your best vehicles over and over and over again. But even as you're curving out, it's not awful. You jam it on 2, you trade with their 2-drop, it goes to the graveyard, and then eventually later on in the game, when, you know, you're running out of gas and you have some extra mana to play with, you just put it back in your hand and eventually replay it, and it just keeps coming back over and over. So that endless value is interesting. I think it's a little too expensive to try to use it in something that's built around the endless value, like a sacrifice deck or something like that, because 6 mana for every cycle is a lot. But if it coming back can be super, super relevant for you, I think it actually has a chance of being really, really good. And the way in which it can be super relevant is by mounting, you know, saddling your mounts and crewing your vehicles and stuff like that. So I think in a deck that's using really good mounts and vehicles that need that power 4 to turn them on, this is going to be especially good, because then it ends up being worth it to pay that extra mana to get this thing back and slam it, because it's going to do a lot more when it hits the battlefield, not just be a 2/2. But regardless of that, like I said, just having something on 2 that can trade with their stuff and then eventually someday come back is still pretty good in Limited. So I think this guy's going to be sweet. But next up, we've got Outpace Oblivion, an enchantment for 1 red and 2. It has Start Your Engines, and when this enchantment enters, it deals 5 damage to up to 1 target creature or planeswalker. You can also pay 2 mana, sacrifice this enchantment. It deals 2 damage to each player who doesn't have max speed. What an interesting card. In a burn deck, this can be removal while also not coming down on your card count of things that can help kill your opponent and just get there and win the game. I recently was using a Boros burn deck to rank up on the standard ladder, and a card like this I think would be a really interesting addition that's at least worth experimenting with. The Start Your Engines thing it's a lot easier to get to max speed if you're using burn, but being able to kill a huge relevant creature and then have an enchantment on the battlefield that can sit there and be used for other things, like in sacrifice decks or pixie decks or whatever, and then eventually also just win the game for you if you get them down to only 2 life. That's kind of a lot packed in. Granted, I guess you don't even have to get to max speed, right? Yeah, that makes this card way better. You don't even have to get to max speed to sack the enchantment and deal 2 to the player. You just have to make sure they're not at max speed, which is super interesting, and I think that makes this card even better. So no matter what, unless they get to max speed, you're nuking a big relevant creature and still being able to sack this for 2 and deal 2 to their head, or just have it as sacrifice fodder, or bounce it and replay it with Pixie, or just help start your engines if you're desperate and needed to do that. This does a lot. This card does way more than I realized. I don't know why I thought you needed max speed in order to sack it to do 2 to their head, but knowing that you don't need that now, granted there are going to be circumstances for sure where your opponent gets to max speed and you can't do that, but I mean, I feel like that's probably going to be negligible. This is going to be a super interesting one to try to experiment with for sure. I feel like there's so much potential for this card to be nuts, or it could just end up being a little too slow and not get there. We'll have to wait and see. But next up, we have the last card of today. This is Coalheart Gearhulk, a 5/4 artifact creature construct with Menace and Death Touch for 5 mana in the colors of Rakdos. When this creature enters, you put target creature card with mana value 4 or less from a graveyard onto the battlefield under your control with a finality counter on it. It gains Menace, Death Touch, and Haste. Exile that creature at the beginning of your next end step. Alright, so there's a couple of different things I want to point out about this card that I think are very easy to overlook and that are awesome. The first thing I want to get out there is the obvious thing. The more value you can get off the thing that you bring back, the better it's going to be, since that thing is going to go away at end of turn. So maybe returning something like a Beza or Urtai, so that you can get those enter the battlefield triggers and get more value out of them, could be really, really nice. But the other sort of like secret mode of using this is you can target their creatures, and then you can set up a situation where you pull their creature out of their graveyard, get to attack with it for a turn, and then at the end of turn you exile it and it doesn't go back to their graveyard. So if they have a creature that costs 4 or less that is going to get them value from the graveyard somehow, and you're worried about that mattering down the line, not only do you get some extra value when you play the Gearhulk, but eventually that card is exiled sort of for free as just silver lining value. It doesn't go back to the graveyard and it's just gone. So that's pretty awesome. The other thing I want to point out about this is how awesome it is with clones. And we already saw a clone in today's spoilers. That card would go really well with this, but any clone would go really well with this. In fact, every clone would go really well with this, because if you can just self-mill all of your clones into the graveyard and play a Coalheart Gearhulk, well, then you just target a clone, bring it back, it enters the battlefield as a copy of the Gearhulk, and then targets another clone with the ETB ability again, and you keep doing it. So every single clone just comes back out of your graveyard and becomes a copy, becomes a copy, becomes a copy. And then eventually, when they're all in play, they all have haste as well. Even though they get exiled at end of turn, it doesn't matter. You're attacking with an army of 5/4 Menace Death Touchers with haste, and you just Alpha Strike for the win? So, can we build that deck? Can we make that happen? That seems super fun, and I feel like it has the potential to be actually, like, realistic and relevant. It might not. It might end up being kind of a meme, and too hard to set up, and too slow, and too inconsistent, and all of those things you would normally worry about when building a jank deck. But honestly, that actually has the potential to be relevant, to actually be a deck that's good and can go the distance. We won't know for sure until we experiment with it and see where it can go, but I'm going to absolutely build that because I think it's super fun. And there's at least the one that you can plot in Thunder Junction, the one that we're getting in this set. Mockingbird's not going to work. The one that's a room isn't going to work. There's got to be some other clones though, right? If you guys can think of other clones that are in standard, that is standard legal, definitely let me know in the comments. But we got to try that deck no matter what. I think it's going to be super fun, and it has a chance at being so much more than just a meme and really turning into a dream, or, well, in your opponent's case, maybe a nightmare. But that's going to do it for today. Thank you guys so much for checking out the video. Please like the video. It helps the video get out to so many more people, helps the channel grow, and that means so much to me. Subscribe if you're new so you never miss an upload. We've got the grand finale for Aether Drift spoiler season coming next, and then I've got some crazy deck tech ideas that I've been waiting to get out to you guys, but I've been busy putting up these spoiler videos every day, so those will be coming hot on the heels of that grand finale spoiler video, so look forward to that, and catch me live Monday through Friday over on Twitch. That's twitch.tv/QuarantineCapricorn, because if I'm alive and I'm breathing, I'm there and I'm streaming. In fact, if you're watching this the night it goes live, it's community night, so come on over right now, play games against me. We're going to have a good time. I'll see you there. Thanks so much for checking out my channel. I'd like to give a huge shout out to all of my patrons over at Patreon. Without you guys, this channel would not be possible, so honestly, thank you from the bottom of my heart for all of your contributions. If you haven't yet, like and subscribe. The more likes we get and the quicker we get them, the bigger this channel will grow and the faster it will grow. I'd love nothing more than this channel to become something very special for you guys, but it's entirely up to you how fast that happens. Also, if you'd like more deck techs, that's somewhere over there. And if you'd like to see what else the channel's been up to lately, that's somewhere up that way. Also, subscribe, circle below, do all the things.